All right, diving in today, we've got Slavoj Žižek's The Parallax View,
We've got Stalin, Walter Benjamin, quantum physics,
psychoanalysis, even critiques of modernity. It's classic Žižek.
and they're all like connected by this idea of parallax, but it's not immediately clear what he's really driving at.
So we need to figure out, like, what's the big argument here? What's Žižek trying to tell us about reality, about knowledge, about ideology even, with this whole parallax thing?
Right, right. Because he uses parallax in so many different ways.
Well, he starts by defining it as this gap that separates like a concept or an idea or even a thing from itself.
So it's like there's always this difference, this distance within a thing itself.
Yeah, like a fundamental split. And he argues this isn't just some accident. It's not like, oh, we just haven't figured it out yet. He says this difference is irreducible. It can't be resolved or erased.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. So,
Yeah.
like, how does that play out in, say, quantum physics?
Oh, he uses the example of wave-particle duality. You know, how light can be both a wave and a particle depending on how you observe it.
Oh, yeah, I remember learning about that. But how's that a parallax?
Because it shows that even something as fundamental as light isn't a simple, unified thing. It has this gap, this split built into it. It's both things at once, but you can only ever see one side of it at a time.
So it's like the way we observe it creates this split, right?
While Zizek would argue it's not just about observation. The split's already there, inherent to the thing itself. We just become aware of it through different observations.
I see. And I guess that kind of connects to what he says about the brain and neurobiology, too.
He talks about this idea that there's, like, no one home in the brain.
What does he mean by that?
Well, you can look at the physical structure of the brain, all the neurons firing, and you won't find consciousness in there.
So, like, even though we experience ourselves as conscious, unified beings, that experience doesn't quite map onto the physical reality of our brains.
Right. There's this gap between subjective experience and the material reality of the brain. And that gap is a parallax. He's saying this gap is everywhere, from the tiniest particles to the way we think about ourselves.
Okay, so he's using examples from science, but he doesn't stop there, right? What about, like, philosophy?
Oh, absolutely. He talks about the ontological difference, which is this fancy way of saying there's a gap between meaning and the real.
So, like, the way we understand the world, the way we give it meaning is always different from what, like, the actual world itself.
Yeah, there's always this excess, something that escapes our attempts to grasp it completely.
And hold on, I'm remembering something else he talks about. Dialectical and historical materialism.
Yeah.
How do those fit in?
He actually uses that as another example of parallax. He says they're basically the same thing, but they represent a shift in perspective.
Okay, so it's not that one is right and the other is wrong, but that they're looking at the same thing from different irreconcilable angles.
And that difference in perspective actually changes the picture, even though it's the same thing being looked at. He even brings up the death drive as an example of something that pops up with this shift.
Wow, that's heavy. We'll definitely have to unpack that more later. But okay, so we've got this gap, this parallax showing up everywhere. What's Zizek doing with it? Like, what's the point of all this?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. He starts talking about Kojin Karatani and his work on Kant.
Oh, yeah, and he specifically focuses on Karatani's interpretation of the Kantian antinomies, right?
Huh.
And he says there's this critical potential in that parallax view.
He's basically saying that the point isn't to try and resolve these contradictions, these antinomies, but to recognize that they're irreducible.
Hold on. Antinomies.
Yeah.
For those of us who haven't spent, years studying Kant.
Right, sorry. Basically, there's situations where you have two completely opposite conclusions that both seem logically sound.
Oh, okay, I get it. Like an unsolvable paradox.
Pretty much. And Kant tried to resolve them, tried to come up with a way to reconcile those contradictory conclusions.
And Zizek's saying, through Karatani, that we shouldn't try to do that. Why not?
Because, he says, the real insight comes from accepting that the antinomy itself is the key. It's the site of radical critique.
So instead of looking for a way to make the contradictions disappear, we should focus on the contradictions themselves.
Yeah. The fact that we can't resolve them tells us something important about the limits of our knowledge, about the nature of reality itself. He gives this great example.
Okay, lay it on me.
Well, he talks about how Kant dealt with the whole empiricism versus rationalism debate.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one back in the day. Like, do we gain knowledge through experience, through our senses? Or is it through reason, through logic?
And Kant didn't pick a side. He didn't try to synthesize them into some grand unified theory. He said, nope, There's this irreducible tension between them.
So both are necessary, but they can't be fully reconciled.
Right. And this leads to his idea of the thing in itself.
Ah, the infamous thing in itself. The ultimate reality that we can never truly know, right?
Well, that's the traditional interpretation, but Zizek, following Karatani, argues that the thing in itself isn't some unknowable entity that exists completely outside our experience.
So how do we understand it then?
He says it's actually something that becomes discernible through the antinomic character of our experience. We can only grasp it, or the idea of it, because of those contradictions that we were talking about. It's like the thing in itself is the effect of those contradictions.
Okay, so instead of saying, oh, we can't know the thing in itself because it's beyond our reach, he's saying we can only glimpse it through the gaps, through the paradoxes in our own experience.
Precisely. And this is a crucial point because it sets the stage for how he moves from Kant to Hegel. Zizek argues that Hegel radicalizes Kant by saying that this gap, this parallax, isn't just an epistemological problem, a problem of how we know things. It's baked into reality itself.
Hold on, slow down a second. How does Hegel go further than Kant here?
Well, for Kant, the main concern was figuring out the limits of human reason, how we can know things. The thing in itself, even if we can't know it directly, was still out there.
Okay, so there's still this assumption of some ultimate reality behind the appearances.
Yeah, like a true world that we can't access fully. But Hegel comes along and says, wait a minute, the real problem isn't what's behind the appearances, it's the appearances themselves.
So the focus shifts from the unknowable reality to the knowable but still deceptive appearance.
He's saying that every reality, every way we understand the world is always already framed, mediated, shaped by a particular perspective. And that means there's always a parallax built into it.
Because there's no neutral, objective way to see the world. We're always looking through some kind of lens.
Right. And for Hegel, this parallax isn't just like two different views of the same object. It's asymmetrical. There's a fundamental difference between those two perspectives.
Can you give me an example? Like, how is this different from just saying, oh, people see things differently?
Imagine two people looking at a painting. One might focus on the colors, the brushstrokes, the formal elements. The other might be more interested in the subject matter, the historical context, the artist's intentions.
Okay, so they're both looking at the same painting, but they're seeing different aspects of it.
Yes, but Hegel is saying it's even more than that. The difference in perspective isn't just about seeing different parts, it creates a fundamentally different relationship to the painting.
So it's not like two sides of the same coin. It's more like two different coins altogether.
The parallax introduces a real difference, not just a difference in perception. And this gets even more complicated when you apply it to, say, psychoanalysis.
Which, of course, Zizek does. He brings in Lacan and this whole idea of l'objet petit. Can we try to make that a little less inaccessible?
Sure. Think of l'objet petit as that thing you always want, but you can never quite grasp. It's a lack, a void that drives your desire.
Okay, so it's not a specific thing, but more like the feeling of wanting something, the gap between what you have and what you desire.
Yeah, something like that. And Žižek argues that this l'objet petit is directly related to the parallax gap in psychoanalysis. He uses this really interesting example, referencing Jean Laplanche's work on Freud's theory of seduction.
Right, and it has to do with this tension between the idea of actual parental seduction, like a real event, and the psychoanalytic focus on the child's fantasy, right?
You have this conflict between something that might have happened in the real world and the way the child internalizes and interprets it through their own fantasy. And for Žižek, this reflects the Kantian antinomy structure we were talking about earlier. He argues that this l'objet petit a, this void at the heart of desire, actually functions as a transcendental scheme, like a blueprint for how we learn to desire.
Its structures are very wanting.
Yes, and of course he connects this back to Hegel by saying that even the Hegelian dialectic of the subject exhibits this parallax structure.
Okay, remind me, what's the Hegelian dialectic again?
It's basically this process where the subject, the individual, puts forth an idea, a meaning, or even just does something in the world, but the essence of that act always escapes them. It takes on a life of its own, so to speak, and often ends up undermining their original intent.
So like you set out to do one thing, but the meaning of your action ends up being something else entirely.
Yeah, it's like there's this inherent ecstatic dimension to the subject. It's open to otherness, to a kind of self-loss even. The meaning you project doesn't just disappear. It becomes independent and ends up influencing you in ways you didn't foresee.
Okay, so there's a gap between your intention and the outcome of your action.
Huh?
Another parallax. And this applies to everything, from individual actions to large-scale historical movements.
That's what Zizek argues. Yeah, he sees this parallax at work in everything from personal relationships to, political revolutions.
Right, which brings us to his critique of alternate modernities, right?
Yeah.
He uses this parallax lens to challenge this whole idea that different cultures can develop their own unique versions of modernity.
Yeah, he's pushing back against that. He argues that this concept often ignores the underlying universality of global capitalism. He's saying, look, whether you're talking about Western liberal democracy or, say, Chinese state capitalism, they're all operating within the same basic system.
So focusing on the differences, like cultural differences, can actually obscure the deeper, more fundamental similarities.
And he sees this as a way of masking the inherent contradictions and antagonisms within capitalism itself. Like, we're so busy debating the merits of different models of modernity that we miss the bigger picture. He even uses fascism and communism as examples.
Saying they're both failed alternate modernities.
Yeah, he's arguing that they both ultimately failed to escape the fundamental logic of capital.
Okay, so the parallax view helps us see past these surface-level differences and understand the underlying structure that connects seemingly disparate things.
Precisely. And this leads to a really interesting point he makes about universality. He's drawing on Pauline thought here, arguing that true universality isn't achieved by trying to be neutral or objective, but rather by engaging from a particular subjective position.
So instead of trying to find some abstract universal standpoint, you have to start from your own specific situated perspective.
He's saying that antagonism, conflict, is always already present in any particular group or identity. And it's through confronting that antagonism that you can access a more genuine universality. He uses this example. There is neither Jew nor Greek.
Right, like the Christian idea that in Christ, all distinctions are erased.
Yeah, but he's interpreting it in a very specific way. He's saying it's not about creating a homogenous group where everyone is the same. It's about recognizing that the fundamental struggle, the antagonism, transcends those specific group identities. It operates on a different level.
So true universality comes from recognizing the particularity of your position, not by trying to erase it.
Exactly. And this ties into his discussion of Lacan's concept of the non-all. Have you ever come across that idea before?
I've heard of it, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it. Something about the universal being incomplete.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Basically, it means that any attempt to articulate a complete, all-encompassing system will always fail. There will always be something left out, an exception that sustains the whole thing.
So you can never have all the truth because there's always something missing.
Right. Truth itself is non-all. And this ties back to the parallax because it highlights that there's always this inherent gap, this incompleteness in any system, any ideology, even any way of understanding the world.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. So the parallax isn't just a visual metaphor, like two slightly different views of the same thing. It's this much deeper idea about the irreducible gaps and differences that structure reality itself.
And those gaps, those differences, are where the real action is. That's where the critical potential lies. He then uses this to talk about the law and the big other.
Ah, yes, more Lacanian delights. Can you unpack that one for me? Because it's pretty central to his whole argument, right?
It is. So the big other, in Lacan's theory, is this symbolic order, the network of meanings and rules and structures that we live within. It's like the background against which our lives play out.
Okay, and what's the law got to do with it?
Well, the law is one of the main ways the big other manifests. It's like the voice of authority that tells us what's right and wrong, what's permissible and what's forbidden. But here's the twist.
Did me.
Zizek, drawing on both Kafka and Lacan, argues that the ultimate secret of the law is that it doesn't really exist. Or, more precisely, that the big other, the authority behind the law, is fundamentally non-existent.
Wait, so he's saying the law is meaningless? That there's no real basis for it?
Not exactly. He's saying that the big other, the source of the law's authority, is a kind of void, an empty space. It doesn't exist in any concrete, substantial way. But here's the thing, that non-existence doesn't make the law powerless.
So how does it still have power if there's nothing behind it?
Because it becomes this impossible real, a kind of absence that nonetheless structures our reality. It's like a phantom limb. You know, people who have lost a limb can still feel it, even though it's not there anymore.
So the law is like this phantom authority. We feel its force, even though there's no real substance to it.
It gets its power from its very impossibility. And this links directly to his discussion of the death drive.
Okay, this is where things always get a little intense with Žižek. He takes this Freudian concept and really pushes it to the limit.
Yeah, he distinguishes the death drive from what he calls the nirvana principle. Like, the death drive isn't simply about seeking oblivion, a return to nothingness.
So it's not just a drive towards self-destruction.
Right. He sees it as a fundamental counterforce to desire, a drive to disrupt the continuity of being, to introduce imbalance, like a drive toward the cut itself.
The cut.
Yeah, the break, the gap, the parallax. He's saying the death drive is what disrupts the smooth functioning of things, what introduces the possibility of something new.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So it's not about annihilation, but about breaking down existing structures to make way for something different.
And this ties into the role of fantasy, which he sees as a way of mediating the gap between the subject and the real. He's arguing that the unconscious isn't some mysterious realm outside language and reason. It's actually the very act of naming, of imposing order onto the chaos of the real.
So the unconscious isn't something we can access through therapy or dream interpretation. It's the very structure of our language, our thought processes.
Yeah, the way we create meaning, categorize the world, it all involves this fundamental act of naming, of separating things out and giving them identities. And that act itself introduces a parallax, a gap between the real and the way we symbolize it.
So even our most basic attempts to understand the world create this gap, this parallax, because we're always imposing our own categories, our own interpretation.
And this has profound implications for ethics, politics, everything.
And of course, Zizek doesn't shy away from exploring those implications. He talks about the difficulty of ethical action, of how hard it is to actually do the right thing, even when you have a strong theoretical understanding of ethics.
Yeah, he brings in Kant again, talking about the idea of an enlightened individual who no longer needs an external master, someone who can take responsibility for their own freedom.
But he's also acknowledging the difficulty of living up to that ideal, right?
Absolutely. He's not saying it's easy. In fact, he's pointing out the inherent tension, the parallax between external authority and this idea of internal moral autonomy. And this perspective really informs his critique of ideology.
Which, for Žižek, is always lurking just beneath the surface, right? He's got that great line about the obscene underside of ideology.
He's saying that ideology often functions through this obscene supplement, this hidden element that contradicts the official message, but is actually necessary for it to function. Like the example he gives of the displacement of class conflict into culture wars.
Right. So instead of focusing on the economic inequalities and power structures, we get caught up in debates about identity politics and cultural values.
And he's not saying those debates aren't important, but that they can serve to distract us from the underlying material conditions.
It's like a smokescreen, obscuring the real issues at play.
Right. And he suggests that irony can be a powerful tool for ideological critique because it can expose these contradictions, these parallaxical gaps within the dominant narrative.
Okay, so by highlighting the inconsistencies, the absurd elements, the things that don't quite add up, we can start to see through the ideology.
And this same parallax lens informs his analysis of the state and revolution.
Where he's really questioning those grand narratives of historical progress, right?
Yeah.
He's not buying into this idea that history is some linear march towards a better future.
No, he sees it as much more messy, more contingent. He's highlighting the parallax between the idealized goals of revolution and the often violent and contradictory outcomes. And he emphasizes the entanglement of political power with pre-political forms of violence.
So, like, even when you're trying to create a more just and equitable society, you can't escape the violence that's inherent in the system itself.
Right. And he's not condoning violence, but he's acknowledging that it's always present, even in those movements that aim to overcome it.
It's another one of those irreducible tensions, those paradoxes that we have to grapple with. And, you know, he doesn't just focus on politics and ideology.
Yeah.
He even applies this parallax view to contemporary debates about consciousness in the brain.
Oh, yeah. He's really interested in that stuff. He draws on thinkers like Metzinger and Dennett, those neuroscientists and philosophers of mind who are trying to understand how consciousness arises from the material processes of the brain.
And, of course, he finds parallax there, too.
He points out the tension between our subjective experience of consciousness, the feeling of being a unified self, and the scientific explanations that focus on neural networks and brain activity.
So, like, even though science can tell us a lot about how the brain works, it can't fully account for the experience of consciousness itself.
Right, and Žižek argues that this gap, this parallax, is crucial. He even suggests that the self, the way we experience ourselves as unified individuals, might actually be a kind of phenomenal construct, a product of the brain's self-modeling processes.
So the self is a kind of illusion. A useful fiction that helps us navigate the world.
Something like that. He's not saying it doesn't exist, but that it's not this simple, solid thing that we often assume it to be. And of course, he takes this even further by applying it to theology.
Of course he does.
Yeah.
Zizek loves to push the boundaries. So what's he saying about God and all that?
Well, he talks about the paradox of good and evil in God. Like, how can a benevolent God allow suffering? How can a perfect being contain both good and evil within itself?
Yeah, that's a classic theological conundrum.
And he sees it as another example of parallax. He's saying that these seemingly contradictory aspects of God aren't just a problem for theologians to solve. They point to a fundamental truth about the nature of the divine, about the limits of our understanding. He even applies it to the interpretation of Christ's sacrifice.
Right, he's arguing that there are parallaxical dimensions to that story as well, right?
He's challenging the traditional interpretations and suggesting that there's something much more complex, more paradoxical going on. And then, in one of his most provocative moves, he uses this parallax lens to talk about anti-Semitism.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting, but also potentially controversial.
Definitely. He's drawing on the work of Jean-Claude Milner, who argues that the concept of Jews within the European ideological imaginary functions as a kind of parallaxical element.
Meaning what? Like, they're seen as both inside and outside society.
Yeah, something like that. Milner's argument is that Jews represent this obstacle to social unification, this element that prevents the creation of a homogeneous, unified society. And Zizek sees this as a perfect example of how the parallax can operate on a social and political level.
So it's not just about different viewpoints or perspectives.
Yeah.
It's about how certain groups or ideas can become these points of irreducible difference, these gaps that can't be closed.
And this leads directly into his analysis of the relationship between global capitalism and democracy.
Where, once again, he finds those inherent tensions, those contradictions.
Absolutely. He's engaging with thinkers like Hart and Negri, who argue that global capitalism has created new possibilities for resistance and emancipation. But he's also looking at Badiou's work, which is much more critical of democracy. Badiou argues that democracy has become the dominant ideology, the master signifier of our time, which actually prevents true political change.
So is Zizek saying democracy is the problem? Do we need to get rid of it?
It's not so simple. He's more interested in highlighting the contradictions, the parallax within democracy itself. He's saying that it's both a space of potential freedom and a system that can reinforce existing power structures. And this leads to one of his most intriguing ideas, the concept of a politics of subtraction.
Okay, that sounds cryptic. What's he getting at with that?
Well, it's connected to that famous line from Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, I would prefer not to. Remember that?
Oh yeah, Bartleby, the ultimate passive resistor. He just refuses to participate in the system.
And Zizek sees that stance, that refusal, as a kind of political act. He's suggesting that true change might not come from proposing new alternatives, but from withdrawing from the existing system, from subtracting yourself from its logic.
So instead of trying to fix the system from within, you create a gap, a parallax, by refusing to play by its rules.
And that refusal can be a powerful form of resistance because it reveals the contingency of the system, the fact that it relies on our participation to function.
Wow, okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. I'm starting to feel like I have a better grasp of what Zizek's trying to do with this whole parallax thing, but like to really boil it down, what's the takeaway for our listener? What's the core thesis of the parallax view?
I think it's this. The concept of parallax offers a crucial framework for understanding the fundamental contradictions and differences that shape our reality, our knowledge, our entire world. It's about moving beyond simple oppositions, easy answers, and recognizing that there are always these irreducible gaps and shifts in perspective.
So don't try to smooth over the rough edges. Don't look for simple solutions. Embrace the paradoxes, the inconsistencies, the things that don't quite fit.
Because those are the places where the real insights, the possibilities for change, lie hidden. And that's true whether you're thinking about physics, politics, religion, or even just your own everyday life.
It's about recognizing that there's always more to the story, more to the picture, than what's immediately apparent. And that the most interesting things often happen in those spaces, in those gaps, where things don't quite line up.
And it's not just about recognizing the gaps, but about learning to think with them, to use them as a tool for critique, for analysis, for understanding the world in a more complex and nuanced way.
Okay, so that's the big picture. But can we give our listener a more concrete example, something they can apply in their own life?
Sure. Think about any time you've had to make a choice, any decision, big or small. It could be something simple, like deciding what to eat for dinner.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now, on the surface, it seems like you have a free choice, right? You can choose from a variety of options.
Right, I can have pasta or a sandwich or order takeout. But
But those choices aren't really free, are they? They're constrained by all sorts of factors that you might not even be aware of.
like what I have in the fridge, how much money I want to spend, how much time I have to cook.
Exactly. So there's this parallax, this gap between the appearance of free choice and the underlying necessity that shapes those choices.
Oh, I see. So even in something as mundane as choosing what to eat, there's this hidden structure at play that influences our decisions.
And recognizing that parallax, that gap between appearance and reality, can help you make more informed decisions, understand your own motivations better, and even challenge those assumptions about free will and agency.
Okay, that's really helpful. It's like by understanding the concept of parallax, you start to see those hidden structures, those underlying forces that are always at work, even in the most ordinary aspects of life.
And that can be incredibly empowering because it allows you to step outside of those structures, to question them, and to potentially even change them.
All right, so we've given our listener a lot to think about. Any final thoughts, any parting words of wisdom from Zizek or, from us?
Well, if there's one thing I hope our listener takes away from this deep dive, it's this. Don't be afraid to embrace the complexity, the contradictions, the gaps. That's where the real action is. That's where the potential for understanding, for growth, for change lies.
And remember, the parallax view isn't just some abstract theoretical concept. It's a tool that you can use to engage with the world in a more critical and nuanced way.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, keep looking for those gaps, those parallaxical moments in everything you encounter. You might be surprised by what you discover.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a final, provocative thought to ponder. We've talked about how our understanding of reality is always shaped by these parallaxical shifts, these gaps and differences.
But what does that mean for the very idea of truth? If we can never fully escape these shifts, these differences in perspective, can we ever truly grasp an objective, universal truth?
Or are we always, in some sense, caught in a web of interpretations, a kaleidoscope of perspectives, with no ultimate ground to stand on?
It's a question that has haunted philosophers for centuries, and honestly, there's no easy answer. But it's a question worth asking, worth wrestling with, because it goes to the very heart of how we understand ourselves and the world around us.
So keep that question in mind as you continue your explorations. You never know what parallaxical insights you might uncover along the way.